Good morning, good day, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Real Life Research Institute African Program webinar session. My name is Rimbo Kwaramba. I am a research associate at Real Life. This webinar session is about rethinking climate adaptation in Africa. This webinar session aims to recenter locally grounded adaptation climate responses related to the Sahel climate conflict, migration synthesis under the BAOBAB initiative, expert insights on misinformation, disinformation, and the implications under adaptation governance, as well as lived experiences from a local leader in civil society, especially in high risk communities in Sierra Leone. So please do help
We can't hear
in
you. I don't know if
welcoming.
other people are hearing you. Sorry for that.
Sorry. Oh, sorry. Can you kindly mute your mics? And please do hold your hands till we reach to the Q&A session. So please do help me welcoming our moderator, Miss Lina. She'll be coordinating with our speakers to give us the discussion, the highlights, and the coordination of the webinar session. In the meantime, please do keep your mics on mute up until we reach the Q&A session. For the Q&A session, we're going to use the chat box to express your comments, your contributions, as well as your questions, which will be read out by the moderator. So our moderator is Miss Lina, who is a PhD candidate in international development and global studies at University of Ottawa. Her research focuses on climate insecurity and the nexus in Nigeria. Please do help me in welcoming Miss Lina to the stage. Miss Lina, over to you.
Thank you, Rosalind. Thank you so much for this amazing introduction. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody who joined us today for this very, very interesting discussion that we're going to have about climate adaptation in sub-Saharan Africa or in Africa, and the amazing points that we're going to touch through our speakers today. So we're going to hear from them and through their presentations, and then we will open the Q&A. So please do hold your questions until our speakers have finished with their presentations. And without further ado, let's start with Dr. Patricia Abdullahi. Dr. Patricia is a lecturer and dean of the Faculty of Agriculture and Food Science at the University of Makeni, Sierra Leone, and founder of the Center of Excellence for Environment and Climate Change. She holds a PhD in Environmental and Water Resources Engineering, with research focused on how climate change affects drought severity at the watershed level. Her work also includes developing low-cost approaches to treat acid mine drainage and heavy metal contamination. A member of the University of Makeni Scientific Committee, Dr. Patricia Abdullahi is actively engaged in environmental governance and is particularly passionate about gender and climate change, with a strong focus on the impacts of climate change on women in agriculture. What a fascinating biography. Thank you very much, Dr. Patricia, for making the time to join us today, and we look forward to hearing your presentation. Over to you. So you are on mute? Yes, perfect.
Do I have to share the screen from my end?
As I suppose you could do it from your end, but I think we can also share it from our end if necessary. Okay, perfect. Lovely, we can see it. Thank you.
Okay. So I should go ahead, right?
Yes,
Hello?
please. Yes,
Okay.
please. Yes.
Good afternoon, everyone from my end. Thank you very much for that introduction. It's an honor to represent my country, Sierra Leone, on this climate discussion, especially the University of Makeni, where I'm working. This presentation today, I will share practical lessons from vulnerable communities in Sierra Leone and how locally grounded adaptation must become central to our policy making as well as financing. So my topic for this presentation will be locally driven climate resilience in Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone is a small country in West Africa. We have a tropical climatic zone on this part of West Africa. Due to the effect of climate change, we now experience a lot of torrential rainfall, which has affected life and properties. We all know climate change is now a live and reality experience across Africa, especially in our own country here. And vulnerable communities face series of flooding, coastal erosion, food insecurity due to the impact of climate change, heat stress. We now even experience a lot of heat even when there are periods of rain, as we are experiencing now. We are in the rainy season, but we still experience a lot of heat. This is due to the effects of this climate change we are now experiencing. Displacement, people migrate from their place of origin to other places because of this effect. And however, adaptation investments are increasing, but the intervention still fail to protect the most vulnerable population in our country. Our country, Sierra Leone, face risk of climate challenges, and majority of these challenges are recurrent urban flooding, which we experience every year in Freetown, and that has resulted to a lot of people losing their lives and properties. Coastal erosion is becoming a normal coastal areas because people are now building houses along the coastal areas, which cannot protect them from sea level rise. Informal settlement is also another disaster. Poor drainage systems in our urban cities, wherein our drainage systems are filled with garbages. Waste management pressures, because we still have challenges on how do we manage our waste in this country. Food insecurity due to the impact of climate change. Agricultural production is now becoming very low because of the impact of climate change. Increased rainfall variability. We now experience, even in times we are supposed to experience rainfall, we don't experience rainfall. In times we are not supposed to experience rainfall, we experience heavy downpour of rain. Especially in the urban area, in places we call like Kube, Poti, and Wokupa. These areas are faced series of challenges due to climate change. However, the limitations of the current adaptation models is why many adaptation strategies have failed. Why have they really failed in adapting to these climate problems we are now having? One of them is externally designed interventions. The interventions that are being designed by external donors to address these issues do not fit to the current situations we are having. And it's also because one size fits all programming. Most of the programs just have one way of intervening in these problems. So we still experience some of these issues. Limited local participation, especially women. Women are not allowed to freely express or put in their own participation in decisions about climate policy and climate financing. Weak incorporation of indigenous knowledge. We all know how significant indigenous knowledge is to climate adaptation, wherein most people in our country today still in villages practice this knowledge, which has helped them to adapt to climate change. We also have poor understanding of local social realities and short-term project cycles. Some projects they are having are not for long-term purposes, and therefore when these projects fade away, that's where the problems start again. So these are the common problems we are facing in Sierra Leone. But however, we do have what we call community-led adaptation in Sierra Leone. This community-led adaptation in Sierra Leone, we call them no wait for government adaptation approach. They do not have to wait for government to intervene in some of these climatic problems we are experiencing. They start it on their own. That is why we call them no-wait government adaptation approach. We have community drainage cleaning. Most communities, as you can see, there are pictorial evidence in this picture, even though we have series of problems of our drainage systems and how do we manage this waste that cause a lot of effects during periods of rain. However, we have what we call community drainage clearing. They do this in different communities to at least clear the drainage for proper flow of water during the rainy season. Informal flood and early warning practices by this community. Some people use their crops to predict what the weather will be like or what the rainfall will be like in the next 1 to 2 months, which has helped them also to practice their agricultural production. Waste management initiatives. We now have small groups of organizations in Sierra Leone. We do recycle plastic waste to things like tiles and other forms. So it reduces the amount of waste the environment. We do have also what we call community mobilization, locally resilience network, and self-organized emergency response team, wherein community will come in as a group of people to at least share their ideas and how people practice things that will help them minimize the impacts of climate change. Why local knowledge matters. This is very important. Even though we now have a modern initiative to minimize the impact of climate change, the value of indigenous knowledge is still of significance in Sierra Leone because it has helped to minimize the impact of climate change. First is due to historical environmental understanding. They do understand how the environment was before it is now, and they have practical adaptation methods they can practice in their various communities. They also look at context-specific risk awareness, what is in the environment that they know to, and they put trust in this community they practice. So it is this model is very effective in terms of climate adaptation because it combines both traditional and scientific knowledge. However, one of the biggest problems we are having in adapting to these climate measures is what we call climate misinformation or disinformation. This is a ongoing threat to climate action in Sierra Leone, and it has a lot of impact because it weakens public trust, it distorts scientific evidence that we are supposed to follow due to early warning systems, it undermines the indigenous knowledge that should be practiced by our communities, it delays policy action, and it creates confusion among climate risks. So because people do not know how to inform the public about early warning systems, this also will create a great impact on climate measures in Sierra Leone. However, one of the most important things is the contribution of women to climate adaptation measures in Sierra Leone. Women play a significant role when it comes to agriculture and climate change. The gender dimensions of climate variability in Sierra Leone is of significance. However, women faces disproportionate impacts because agricultural productivity, lost water insecurity, increased unpaid care burdens, and reduced economic opportunities. That is why most times when their produce are supposed to be harvested, they face challenges, they face low level loss, they face decline in agricultural productivity. And these need responses so that these measures can be adapted to. How can we do this? Gender responsive adaptation planning, women-led resilient initiative. Women should be involved in policy making in terms of climate change because in our country, women are people who are most practicing agriculture. They are in the field and they know what they are experiencing and they know how the environment looks like and how is that been before. So their participation in climate policy and climate financing be of significance to adapt to this climate change that is happening. What Africa needs now in terms of these climate problems they are having, we should try to reimagine climate adaptation in Sierra Leone. How can we do this? The first one is locally led adaptation. Communities must shape adaptation decisions. Community must be part of decision making when it comes to climate change. Long-term financing. As I mentioned earlier, some projects fail to adapt to climate change because of the short cycle of projects they're having. We should be thinking of long-term financing to climate issues because these are issues that are happening every year. Because, for example, in Sierra Leone, we have two distinct seasons, the rainy season and the dry season. In December, January, and February, we experience what we call Harmattan. It's a season of complete dryness and heat waves and cool weather. So the two major ones are the rainy season and the dry season. So if we don't have proper planning in terms of climate change, in the rainy season, that is why we are facing some of these challenges like flooding, coastal erosion, and the rest. Should be able to support sustainable community resilience, support people who will be able to use their local knowledge to practice climate adaptation. Knowledge integration is key. I always say 2 better heads are better than one. People coming together to put in their knowledge in terms of climate adaptation is of significance. How can we do this? Combine science with locally indigenous expertise. When we combine science and traditional knowledge, then we'll be able to address some of these issues that we are having. The other thing is also strong governance. We should be able to improve accountability and inclusion, leaving no one behind as one of the key things in our SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals that we are practicing. People should be held accountable of what they are contributing to the environment, and inclusion of everybody will be of significance. And then lastly, trust information system. We should be able to counter misinformation and build climate literacy in our various countries. That will help us to at least minimize the impact of climate change. There are various recommendations to these problems that we are having. There are various recommendations to the already practiced traditional knowledge we are having. One of them is government should integrate local actors into climate planning. We do not have to leave them behind. Their voices matters. Their knowledge matters. They should be incorporated in climate decision making. Also, to strengthen urban resilience systems. The systems in our urban areas are weak, and that is why most times when people experience flooding, urban centers suffer the highest risk of torrential rainfall. Sure, government should also support informal settlements like Kube, Poti, and Rokupa. Support them in terms of climate adaptation. Put them part of the decision making. That is not enough. What else should we need to do? Donors should simplify access to climate finance. There are some climate finance that is very complex for our communities. This should be simplified so that every vulnerable community will be able to access this climate finance to adapt to these problems. Fund community-based adaptation and invest in long-term resilience. Climate change is a problem that happens every year and in every season. Therefore, investing in long-term resilience is key. For us as researchers, we should co-produce knowledge with communities. Our knowledge should not just be on science-based. We need the local knowledge people practice so that it will help us also to minimize this risk. As researchers, we should prioritize applied local solutions. Before this time, we don't experience what we are experiencing, like flooding, coastal erosion. Even if they were there at a minimal rate. Because we've stopped applying local solutions to already based scientific solutions, the problem increases. So local solutions are key to us as a nation, is key to us as a region. So these recommendations would be helpful to donors, policymakers, and us researchers. Thank you. I am Patricia Abdullahi from the University of Macquarie.
Thank you, Dr. Patricia, for this fascinating presentation. I'm sure our participants have benefited quite a lot from your, well-rounded explanations on the challenges in climate adaptation in Sierra Leone and your recommendations. So thank you very much for that. And I really look forward to hearing also what our audience thinks and their questions for you in the Q&A section.
Okay.
So moving forward to our next speaker, Dr. Bushra Bargham. Dr. Bushra Bargham is a researcher in hydrology and artificial intelligence, exploring climate issues related to water resources. She has a PhD in this field from Mohammed VI Polytechnic University. Bushra Bargham specializes in innovative techniques for understanding and forecasting water supply in areas where data is unavailable. In her role as co-lead of the BAOBAB synthesis project, she contributes to research into the complex relationship between climate, conflict, and livelihoods in the Sahel region. Welcome, Dr. Bushra. I am very excited to hear your presentation, especially since our research interests align and overlap. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Bushra and her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Lina. Can you see my screen first?
Yes, we can.
Great. So, hello everyone. Good afternoon, good morning. Thank you for being here. I'm very happy to join this discussion on climate or rethinking climate adaptation in the Sahel. I'm Bushra Bargham, co-lead of the Ascent BAOBAB Synthesis project at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. And today we'll be sharing some insights from our synthesis project on climate vulnerabilities, livelihoods, and community realities. One of the main points I want to emphasize today is that climate impacts or climate change is not experienced as an isolated environmental issue. It's actually interacting with many other components, mainly the livelihoods, community realities, and this is what we are trying to analyze throughout our synthesis project under the BAOBAB synthesis initiative. So for that, so I'll start with talking a little bit about our synthesis project and then talk about some important observations related to rethinking climate adaptations in Africa. Then see how these observations are important for the adaptation approaches that need to be applied over the region. So first of all, the climate impacts in the Sahel are actually deeply interconnected. So we can start by the water, or let's say the climate variability, which is affecting the water availability, the food security, the livelihood, etc. And these actually are affecting the displacement pressures and causing, in some cases, conflicts, and sometimes can to increase the tensions over the natural resources where they are limited. So the climate change is not isolated. It's actually interconnected with many other components, as we said, the water scarcity, the livelihoods in general, and also causing the displacement, pressure, conflict, etc. So this can explain why in some cases, the adaptation approaches that are not considering these interconnections between these components are failing most of the times, because it needs to be seen as one connected system instead of different, or let's say as isolated components. So one of the main observations, or let's say the very first observations from our synthesis project, is that climate stress often acts as a pressure multiplier that interacts with the governance, the poverty, the socioeconomic vulnerabilities, etc. So climate change is not directly causing conflict, but it comes after many steps and many processes. So what we are trying to do through our project, we are going through, let's say, working on many blocks. So first of all, we are considering the regional climate synthesis. So we are trying to focus on the multiple Sahel countries at once, and also the evidence and literature review. We are trying to consider as many possible as we can evidence and extract it from the literature review, because we believe that we have already some very considerable knowledge over that need to be evaluated. So this is what we are trying to do. And we are trying to analyze the climate event dynamics, looking at the climate events their special and temporal changes, their impacts, etc. And what we are, or let's say the main or the core work of our synthesis project is we are trying to analyze the climate livelihood systems, this interaction. So we are trying to understand the links between the extreme climate events, such as the droughts, floods, extreme rainfall, all the extreme climate events, and their connection with the migration, displacement of communities over the region. And in another part, we are trying to see all of these, or let's say this connection, how it is causing the conflicts and the resource competition occurring over the region. So another, let's say, important finding, or let's say important observations from our synthesis project is that climate impacts, as we said, are interconnected. Sorry. Yeah, so they are interconnected and they are actually cascading rather than being isolated. So droughts is affecting agriculture and livestock, and this is also affecting the household income and food insecurities. In some cases, all of this is increasing the migration pressure over the above, or at the level of the communities, and all of this come to cause many or let's say more competitions over land and water that may intensify tensions over those already limited natural resources. So instead of saying that the climate impacts are, let's say, cascading, they are actually isolated. So adaptation systems need to be focused on these interconnected components rather than connect, or let's say focusing on one of these as isolated components. Yeah, and one of the very clear observations that comes from our synthesis project is that water actually is central. Rainfall variability, let's say already climate variability is causing, starting from rainfall variability to prolonged drought, flood, extreme, etc. So, as we may know, over the Sahel region, communities are depending a lot on fed rain agriculture, pastoralist system, etc. And all of this come directly to be impacted by the rainfall and the climate vulnerability. So, in many Sahelian contexts, climate vulnerability is actually deeply linked to the water vulnerability that come to, as we said, cause the other conflicts, displacement, pressures, migration, come also to intensify conflicts that are already there or cause new ones. So the water is actually is in the center. Other very important observation is that the vulnerability over those regions, over the Sahel region, actually is unequal, and this comes to my colleague, her point regarding the let's say the women that are not actually implied into the community life, in political life. This is also true throughout our observations. So we can say that women, for example, the small farmers, and especially the pastoralist, displaced communities are often the communities that are more exposed to climate impacts. That's why the adaptation policies sometimes fail to have like an effective strategy, an effective solution, because they ignore their local local realities, all the components of the region, starting from the women to the pastoralists. And also this point comes to confirm my friends and my colleagues' points regarding the local knowledge. It's very important to consider it because we are talking about the Sahel region as a region experiencing too many crises, too many problems, but we are also ignoring that these regions have already their own strategy for resilience, for adaptation. They are, let's say, adopting more and more approaches to change and to adapt with the climate impacts. It's climate impacts with time. So they are changing their agricultural practices. They are moving from one place to another place. So they have their reasons. They have their also logic. They have their knowledge that need to be considered. And for us, like an effective strategy and effective adaptation for such region need to take into consideration this local knowledge, because it comes from the communities and the people that are directly impacted by the climate change. So the resilience strategy is already existing locally and cannot be top-down. The adaptation actually cannot be top-down technical solutions. They need to be merged and they need to be seen in light of these local knowledge. So one message to say here is that effective or an effective adaptation must actually integrate scientific evidence, which we are doing all, but actually it needs to take also the local knowledge and the lived experience into consideration. Yeah, so for us, the adaptation, or let's say an effective adaptation approaches need to move from a reactive to anticipatory adaptation. So it's not only responding after crisis, but it's actually need to be prepared before the crisis happens. So it needs to be more reactive than anticipatory, or actually anticipatory adaptation. Also, an adaptation approaches, an effective one needs to be locally grounded one. As we said, policies designed far from communities often fail. Why? Because they are ignoring the local knowledge that is already there, because they are ignoring how people and the communities are responding to those, let's say, to those changes, to those impacts. And those, let's say, the responses of these communities are not necessarily, let's say, wrong or not necessarily failing, because they succeed to live, they succeed to protect their natural resources in some cases. So it's very from that we can see that we need to take into consideration their knowledge, their way to adapt, how they are changing their practices, their livelihoods, and how they are managing conflict in some cases. So an effective adaptation approaches need to be locally grounded, as we can see here, considering the local knowledge. And also we have the very important point, which is what we are doing here in the Synthesis project, which is the climate adaptation livelihood nexus. So the farming, mobility, water access, income strategies, social systems, all of these are components that come directly to let's say one system dynamic that need to be seen as one system, or as we say here, it's a nexus. So we cannot just focus on the, let's say, the climate event extremes, or focus just on the livelihoods, or focus just on conflicts, etc. We know deeply that these components are interconnected, and one effective adaptation approach need to consider this interconnection. And this is directly what we are trying to, let's say, to get from our Synthesis project, is these interactions between these different components, how the climate stresses are interacting with the livelihoods, and how it's impacting, or let's say, affecting the migration pressure, etc. And yeah, the last point is the adaptation approaches to be an interdisciplinary one, because as we said, we have the climate, we have the hydrology, governance, social realities. So we cannot talk about an effective adaptation approaches while we are working or considering just one discipline. Yeah, focusing on hydrology will make us able to understand what changes are there, what is happening over the region in terms of, let's say, water resources. But we need also the information of how these water resources, being limited or being scarce, are impacting the governance of a region, and also understand how governance are responding to those water scarcity, etc. And on the other hand, which is more important, is to understand how the social reality, how the communities over there, the ones that are directly impacted by those changes, are responding to these changes and considered as very important because it's the very let's say response that is more grounded, that is more real. I'm not saying that we need to ignore the scientific evidence, etc. It's very important. Each component of this is very important, but it needs to be seen in light of the others. So in all, an effective adaptation approaches need to move directly from being reactive to anticipatory already. It needs to consider the local knowledge. It needs to consider all the components as interacted once in one system dynamic, and also to be interdisciplinary one. Yeah, so to conclude, and as we said, the climate stressor, climate impacts are seen as multiplier pressures that comes to affect the livelihood, that come to affect the migration, etc. So it's an interacted process that need to be seen as one connected, as one dynamic system. But we need also to see beyond crisis over the local communities. We have resilience, we have adaptation approaches that need to be considered, that need to be seen and need to be also analyzed. And these resilience and inclusive adaptations pathways need also to be considered and mainly valued. This comes to the third point, which is having these adaptation approaches to be grounded, to consider this local knowledge and the community resilience and how they survive all of these changes. So rethinking adaptations through all of these components is the way to have like an effective and a very successful adaptation for these for such communities. So this is it for from my end. Thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bushra. This was very, very interesting presentation. And I'm sure we have all learned quite a lot from the work on the synthesis project and in your work that you do there. So I really also look forward to hearing also what the follow-up questions that the audience will have. Um, and going to our last speaker, Dr. Andrew Heffernan holds a PhD in political science from the University of Ottawa, where he's an adjunct professor teaching on global governance, environmental politics, and information integrity. His research and policy work focus on climate governance, climate disinformation, and the intersections of environmental change, food systems, and insecurity, particularly in African contexts. He is a senior programs manager at the Center for Information Integrity and fellow at the Center for International Governance and Innovation, CG, where he previously completed a postdoctoral fellowship. Andrew has also served as rapporteur for the Forum for Information and Democracy and held research roles with IFSD and Nexus PFM, bridging academic research with applied policy and governance practice. Dr. Andrew, thank you very much for joining us today and for bringing a very interesting approach and different angle to climate adaptation from the perspective of climate misinformation and disinformation. So we look forward to your presentation. Over to you.
Excuse me. Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for the great two presentations so far. I love these kind of events because I always end up learning so much. And these are kind of things that I can add into my research as well. I'm just going to give a bit more of kind of my background, not to talk more about my bio, but to talk about kind of how I got to where I am with this research and where I'm trying to go with it. I've been interested in and studied climate change for quite some time. And for a long time, I would say kind of climate change was the main thing that kept me up at night, the main concern I saw, kind of the quintessential global challenge. As Obama and many others have said, it is like the challenge of our generation. Or at least it was. And increasingly over the past 5 years or so, as I've increasingly been looking at disinformation and challenges to information integrity, I think it might increasingly be that. and more importantly, the nexus of these two major global challenges, which is climate change and information integrity or lack thereof, and attacks on our information integrity. Basically, because as we know, many societies around the world, we're obviously seeing it in the US, much of the West, and the global North, but obviously the global South very broadly, and Africa more specifically, are not immune from polarization and a growing distrust within societies that I think is to some degree tearing at our social fabric within a lot of countries around the world, but between countries as well. And if we can't agree on basic facts, if we cannot get along, if we cannot have healthy, functioning democracies and communities, we cannot deal with climate change and we cannot deal with much else. On the other side of things, I think that if we can deal with information integrity and contribute to healthier democracies, and especially if we can do so while figuring out a really difficult issue like climate change, we can probably get better at figuring out a lot of other difficult issues as well. My research tends to focus specifically on climate disinformation and information integrity as it relates to environmental concerns. But over the years, as I've been studying this more and more, we see kind of a lot of through lines where if you are the types of actors that are peddling in climate disinformation, you are probably also spreading disinformation about stolen elections and or vaccines and other kind of health issues, security issues, all of these types of things. So again, if we can kind of figure out this in one regard, then we might be able to in others. And alternatively, if we are not able to figure out climate disinformation specifically, we are not going to be able to effectively deal with the climate crisis or these other lines of inquiry, and we will continue to have bigger gaps within society, larger polarization, more and more distrust, and again, just undermining our ability to work collectively together to deal with anything. So, having been studying very broadly these types of issues for quite some time, I've spent a lot of time trying to understand what climate disinformation is, who is attacking information integrity, and specifically who benefits from this. And I think that's a key part to understand. One of my approaches to misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation is suggesting that all of these should be understood probably as disinformation. For those of you aware of those definitions, it's usually most simplistically suggested misinformation is incorrect information that is shared without specific intent. So it might be, your crazy uncle or my mom sharing something on Facebook that is incorrect, but she's not intending to deceive people. And I think important in relation to that intent question is she's not benefiting from it, predominantly economically, but potentially politically as well. As opposed to disinformation, where very often these are fossil fuel companies, petrostates, perhaps Russia, Iran, many others as well that have an interest in us continuing to burn fossil fuels. But there's a number of other actors as well who simply peddle climate disinformation to sow divide within society, because climate change has been demonstrated in my research to probably be the most single polarizing issue that exists, partly because of its long time horizon. We've been dealing with and kind of fighting about climate change for at least a couple decades, and will be for decades to come. Whereas some of the other issues that I've mentioned, like vaccines and masking and elections, kind of come and go. Climate change is here, it's going to continue to be here, and therefore you might not even have an interest in us continuing to burn fossil fuels, but you might be just seeking to fan the flames of polarization in society. So there's these multiple throughways that come. And then on top of that, there's companies like social media companies and kind of the tech bros who benefit economically from us just clicking on these kinds of things and engaging in those battles online. So there are these kind of not so much coordinated, but disparate actors who work in these kinds of campaigns and are extremely well funded and have a great deal of money and use the tools of AI and other technology to target each one of us, because our data is easily available by the devices we use, by the platforms we log on to, depending on what we scroll on, what we click on. That data, as we know, is harvested. And what a lot of people don't know is often sold to third and then fourth and then fifth party users, to the point where there is no protection about our data. It's unclear where it's gone. Many actors are making a great deal of money off it, and down the line it is becoming increasingly weaponized by nefarious actors. I think we can probably already understand why that might be a problem, but particularly as I look at the case of the continent of Africa, as this slide suggests here, Africa is currently contributing still about less than 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions, which is insane because it is a huge continent with tons of people, and barely pollutes more than Canada, where I am from and live, which is only has a population of about 40 million people. So Africa is contributing a small percentage of the cause of climate change currently. And historically, if we look at global greenhouse gas emissions over time, the continent has contributed almost nothing to the problem, but as we know, is experiencing some of the worst impacts of climate change, while also many African states and people and populations being least well equipped to deal with, to mitigate and adapt to these harmful impacts. So there's this kind of perverse paradox in relation to climate change and its impacts on Africa, which is why it's obviously something important to deal with. And as I've mentioned before, while climate change for a long time was kind of the central thing that kept me up at night and is still a crisis that I am very concerned about, we cannot effectively deal with that if we cannot politically implement effective policies to deal with that. And to have effective political buy-in, again, requires those kinds of healthy societies and democracies and communities where we can have conversations and trust one another, where there isn't this huge gap between the right and the left, and polarized societies where large segments of populations distrust the government and distrust academics and distrust experts and maybe even have disdain for these actors. All of these are things that we need to think about in order to be able to effectively deal with the climate crisis, and that is true for states on the African continent as well as other states around the world in the global north and beyond. A further paradox is that very often we see times of challenge, and you know, in Canada certainly we've seen this, but I think around the world, that I think COVID-19 and the pandemic broke a lot of us in a lot of ways, or broke and tore at a lot of our social fabric. And since then, we have been dealing with kind of ongoing economic crises and challenges of affordability and housing affordability, again, around the world for the past 5 or 6 years since the pandemic. And these things don't seem to be letting up or stopping at all. Again, part of the problem is with this is as we are facing more and more challenges and need to work together more and more to effectively implement the kinds of policies that can deal with the climate crisis, as well as all of the other crises that we're facing around the world. Because there's more and more scarcity, very often this turns people inward, and more people are less concerned about fighting climate change, or less willing to invest in fighting climate change, and more concerned about their own pocketbook issues, while also maybe pointing fingers at their neighbors, or people that they want to blame for not having as much. Again, that's kind of further sowing the distrust and the divide within society instead of bringing us together to effectively deal with these kinds of things. Again, in a place like Africa, to the extent that we can summarize sort of the entire diverse continent, there is extreme ecological pressures because, again, the continent and many of the states in Africa are being impacted more by climate change than elsewhere. So there are these ecological pressures with water scarcity, soil degradation, flooding, less food security, all of these kinds of issues that, again, very often lead people to, instead of working well together, turning inward and battling each other for the scarce resources that exist, which makes a problem. Then there's the disinformation gap, where abstract global climate language creates space for manipulation. So as mentioned, as life becomes harder for people around the world, and this is being seen in Canada and being seen in countries across the global south, and certainly on the continent of Africa, because of the challenges people are facing, the very big we are less interested in hearing about things like the Paris targets and limiting greenhouse gas emissions to slow global warming to the maximum of 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. These kinds of things have become kind of like big and broad and global and out there, maybe especially for a continent like Africa that only contributes 3.6% or so of global greenhouse gas emissions. We hear similar arguments in Canada, where Canada only contributes about 2.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Canada, like the continent of Africa, are such small contributors globally. I mean, what difference can we have? Why should I curb my types of life? Why should I drive less? Or why should we produce less oil when we're an insignificant part of the problem? This is one of the challenges because we all do contribute to global greenhouse gas emissions. And if we, with it being what I would call the quintessential global challenge, if we do not all do this together, if we do have bad actors in relation to climate change, we will not be able to deal effectively with the climate crisis. And therefore, there's this disinformation gap that can target people's feelings in this regard by leveraging the small percentage of greenhouse gas emissions that some contribute to the global problem, but also, saying maybe it's too big of a problem. And we've seen disinformation evolve like this over time. On top of there being digital vulnerability, the continent of Africa is obviously, again, huge and diverse, and there is a huge diversity in the degree to which people are digitally plugged in, connected, engaged, the degree to which they have been raised with digital literacy. And again, these are the same kinds of challenges that others face around the world. But as the continent is struggling with governing its own digital sovereignty, and trying to get people connected so that they can engage in the 21st century economy. This is also posing challenges as well as predominantly American companies and their huge amounts of profits, as I mentioned, kind of coalesce with those of fossil fuels as well as nefarious actors who simply want to sow divide. So a lot of this, I think, comes down to a language problem. Again, not to speak of Canada too much in this instance, but one of the things I think about and have studied a lot often is Canada's carbon tax. And for about 5 years, we had a carbon tax implemented by the Justin Trudeau Liberal government in Canada, and it was widely popular to the point where in 2021, in our previous federal election, every party in the Canadian system ran on some version of a carbon tax, even the Conservative Party, who are right-leaning and tend not to support carbon taxes. Fast forward from the 2021 election to the 2025 election, no party was really running on one. And the Liberal Party that had initially implemented the carbon tax won that election on promising to cut the carbon tax, which they subsequently did. So what changed in that amount of time? Well, there was significant disinformation campaigns that were propagated by politicians on the right, fanned by the huge amounts of funding that fossil fuel companies poured into them, as well, again, as those nefarious actors who were simply seeking to sow divide, and they did so pretty effectively in the Canadian society. And then again, much of this played out on the social media platforms where the tech bros had a huge financial incentive for us to be battling each other right and left, saying the carbon tax is good, no, the carbon tax is bad, the carbon tax contributes to the decrease in greenhouse gas emissions, no, it doesn't. The carbon tax was the cause of inflation in Canada, even though all other countries around the world were facing similar levels of inflation at the time. Or no, it doesn't. All of these battles back and forth on social media and the clicks contributed to the billions and billions of dollars that the tech bros were making as well. So where does that leave climate policy moving forward? I think that the global north and the west actually has a lot to learn from Africa in this regard and Africans. Partly because more people on the continent of Africa still rely on some forms of their livelihoods for some part of subsistence agriculture. A lot of Africans tend to be more intimately engaged with the natural environments around them. And this tends to be the case for very few people in kind of the West, the global North, or Canada as a case study I look at. And this impacts how people are targeted by disinformation. The closer you are to the natural environment around you, the closer your livelihoods are and the ability to put food on the table relies to natural environments, the more clear you are going to understand the impacts of climate change. This is something I learned when I was in Namibia for my doctoral research. In the winter of 2020, leading up to COVID, actually, I was studying community-based natural resource management, and the director of one NGO there, I asked her if there was a lot of climate denialism in Namibia, and she said, here people do not have the luxury of not believing in the science. Climate change is here, it is all around us, and it is impacting negatively our ability to live in the immediate. So that's kind of the difference, right? If you live downtown and you're in an urban area and you go to work in a high-rise building, and then you go home and your fridge is full and you go to the grocery store, which is down a paved street, you don't necessarily think about the changes to the environment around you. And maybe that allows you to kind of engage in the back and forth or disinformation about whether climate change is real, or the extent to which it is real, or the extent to which we as individuals or as individual states can impact it. So part of speaking to people, we often hear about needing to meet people where they are, and people are in all different places. People speak different languages. People engage in different types of livelihoods. And again, thinking back to the demise of the carbon tax in Canada, it was largely Justin Trudeau who was its major proponent, going in front of kind of official news conferences and explaining to Canadians why it was good, why it wasn't contributing to inflation, why it was actually contributing to our climate goals. But not a lot of people were here for that. Not a lot of people wanted to listen to the Prime Minister of Canada at all, and specifically Justin Trudeau, because towards the end of his tenure, he became increasingly unpopular. Disinformation and the actors involved in disinformation are really intelligent at targeting all of us in effective and intelligent ways. As mentioned, they are harvesting and they have our data. They know what kind of messaging we are susceptible to. Some of us might be susceptible to simply climate change as a hoax, and they can have targeted messaging to send that our way. Others, some of us might know the science. Obviously, climate change is real, but maybe we're susceptible to believing that EVs are not actually good for the environment, or that carbon taxes cost more than they benefit, or that, critical minerals being mined are worse for the environment than the climate crisis. There's all these types of evolved and targeted messaging that's hard to do and takes a lot of resources and often requires the technology of AI and others. And that's the kind of thing that I think we need to do when we want to effectively communicate climate policy. Meet people where they are. Figure out what kinds of people we want to hear from. Some of us do want to hear from the Prime Minister of a country to tell us what the most effective form of climate policy is. Others of us want to hear from experts, academics. There's a really interesting book that I like and I reference probably too often, but it's called The Influencer Factory. And it's really interesting. It talks about how all of us have influencers in our lives. And when I first heard this, I thought, well, I don't think I do because I'm not on Instagram or TikTok and I don't really watch influencers. But the argument for the book is that all of us do have influencers in our lives. And some of us, those are, people on TikToks trying to sell clothing or something like that, those type of influencers that we all know. But for others, our influencer might be the Prime Minister or an academic, a professor, a teacher, a hockey coach, a soccer coach, a priest, a local community leader, your parents. All of these kinds of people influence our lives in different ways. And again, if we want to effectively communicate climate policy, or for that matter, other types of policies, we, the collective we who care about these kinds of complex, difficult issues, need to get better at meeting people where they are and kind of taking a page out of the disinformation book and using targeted types of messaging to speak to people in their language and use effective influencers to be able to communicate these messages to them beyond simply kind of having the traditional press conference with politicians or academics to communicate these kinds of things. What this means in practice is kind of what this slide shows here, speaking to people about the quality of their air, the quality of their water, protecting their local parks, for farmers, making sure that they have sustainable harvests and yields moving forward. Maybe some people simply do care about the Paris targets and limiting greenhouse gas emissions so that we can meet our goals of 1.5 or 2 degrees of warming. But for a lot of people at this time across the world, polling is showing that that's not speaking to most of us. So we do have to think about what speaks to most of us. And in this era of affordability challenges and the spill out and spill over from COVID-19, that's speaking to people from economic terms and pocketbook issues, and what is either negatively impacting their livelihoods about climate change or what can positively do so as well. One thing that I keep coming back to is in a very short period of time over the last couple of years, exceeding almost everyone's expectations, renewable electricity and power has become the cheapest form of power. It makes no sense to be building new fossil fuel power at this point because renewables have just become cheaper. And that's the kind of thing that we can communicate to people. It doesn't have to be green power. It doesn't have to be solar panels to be able to achieve our Paris targets. It can just be cheaper. It can be more effective and reliable. It can be insulated from issues like the Strait of Hormuz being taken out of commission or these kinds of global fluctuation in commodity prices. If you have your own solar farm, you have virtually limitless access to clean, reliable power, especially on the continent of Africa. That is no shortage of sun, of course.
Sorry, Andrew, just we have less than 2 minutes for your presentation.
Yes, sorry. Yes, I will wrap up quickly. This is kind of some of the stuff that I've gone on over quickly. These are a lot of the tactics that disinformation actors use And it's important both to be aware of them and then also both to be aware of them so that we can fill in this governance gap and limit the disinformation that is out there, but also so that we can, again, learn from this. Disinformation is extremely effective out there. Catherine Hayhoe, a really respected researcher in this regard, says that nothing is as well recycled on this earth as disinformation. And for better or worse, we probably need to borrow from their playbook a bit. And the more we understand disinformation tactics in Africa and elsewhere, the more we can kind of flip this and use it for positive perspectives when it comes to effectively communicating climate or other policies to, again, decrease that tension in society, increase the social trust that we have, and be able to get political buy-in to effective policies for the types of challenges we face. From climate to lived environmental realities, this is kind of what I mentioned already. Again, thinking about this as a language issue, people do care about climate change, but they are maybe less willing to sacrifice in this moment. So if we move away from these kind of really big global notions of the Paris Agreement and climate change to environmental lived realities like water, land, food, forest, urban resilience, and how that impacts people's lives, we can, again, decrease that bridge and divide in society while increasing trust and buy-in for these important policies. Some of this is being done already. There's a few examples here. I'm sure I've shared this deck with the organizers, and thank you for putting this event on so they can share them with you. If you want some more examples, you can see these here and look into them. But there are a number of countries and states in Africa and elsewhere that are already beginning to do some of this. And these are the kinds of things that we can build on within these programs themselves and also mirror in other states in Africa, and the kinds of things that we can think of through individual countries, but also that organizations like the African Union can try to implement from a more continental perspective as well. Some policy recommendations for doing so. Government should think about how to increase information integrity and limit disinformation. I've already mentioned how regional bodies can be a part of this as well. Each individual African country is only so big and so strong, but the more you can work regionally, either with the economic regional organizations or going all the way to the AU, you can become more powerful, especially in trying to govern the tech platforms that have proven extremely difficult to govern, especially at this moment with Donald Trump in the White House and the tech bros seemingly in there with him. And then thinking about international partners as well. A country like Canada is trying to accomplish a lot of these same goals and has been trying to regulate the tech companies and not doing a great job of it. Canada has a huge interest in increasing information integrity, and information is extremely globalized, like the challenges of climate change. And the continent of Africa, countries in Africa, organizations with Africa can work with other middle powers around the world to push back against the excesses of the US, Donald Trump, and the tech companies to, again, try to increase information integrity. So again, this is about meeting people where they are and changing the language that we speak in and decreasing the polarization in society so we can increase trust, bring back our social fabric, create healthy democracies, and therefore hopefully be able to deal with complex challenges like climate change, information integrity, and many others out there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Andrew, for this very compelling presentation. And definitely at a time when we absolutely need to talk about disinformation, misinformation, and distinguish between the two for sure. So many thanks to our three speakers that have raised very, very important points. So before we go to the Q&A from our audience, I would like really to summarize a little bit what all of you have spoken about and ask you, because all of you have spoken about local knowledge and local actors in one way or another. And I know that it keeps, local knowledge keeps coming up every time we talk about climate adaptation and ways in how we can respond to challenges, especially in the context of climate change. So my question to you is, so to Andrew, Bushra, and Patricia, is how do you define local knowledge and local actors in your own research and your own approach? Who is a local actor and what is local knowledge? Is it only on the grassroots level? Is it maybe a different level? Does it have to be somebody who is part, like what does also mean to be part of a community and so on? And what do we do when disinformation penetrates local knowledge? knowledge. So what do we do when a community is so influenced by disinformation that it becomes an integrated part of local knowledge? I'll give you an example for that. So in a lot of communities in Nigeria, South, where I did my research, where the oil industry is the main livelihood or the main economic activity, a lot of communities see climate change as a hoax because they see it as a way that the West wants to curb Nigeria's or the country's potential, to use its fossil fuels and develop. So what do we do when these types of information are such a big part of the narrative? So over to you, and in whichever order you would like to address it.
Hello.
Patricia?
Yes, please.
Yes.
If I can come again, you wanted to know what is local knowledge and who do you refer to as the local actors, right?
Exactly. So how do you define in your own research local knowledge, and who are local actors in your work?
Local knowledge, especially in our setting here, is what people practice, the traditional practices of people that they have been doing that have helped them to minimize the impact of climate change. Here we have a lot of traditional practices that people do, especially to minimize the impact or the effect of climate change when it comes to agricultural productivity. And this knowledge has helped them to at least know when rain falls, when it doesn't, when there are periods of dries, when they are not. And these local actors are people who have lived the experience or the impact of climate change. They are people who have experienced this crisis, and there are people who know how these local tools or these local models have really worked for them. For example, in Sierra Leone here, we have what we call like during the rainy season, people do what we call clearing of drainages. We have a problem of waste management, pressures of waste, and our drainage systems are filled with garbages. So what they do is community mobilization. They come together and do clearing. They also have crops they plant that can predict the weather, or that can tell them it's going to rain at this time. No, it's not going to rain. And these crops also help them to know what they are supposed to plant and when they are not supposed to plant, or when the rain will fall and when the rain will not fall. Most recently now,
Sorry,
what
I'm
people are
just
doing.
going to interrupt. So I'm so sorry to interrupt you, just so that in the interest of time, to give also time for our audience to ask questions. Thank you so much for the fantastic input. But just going to Bushra and Andrew next, and then to our audience. Thank you so much.
All right. Okay.
I can give a brief answer. And what I would say is it's up to individual creators and users of knowledge to decide what is local knowledge or not. I'll point back to my doctoral research again, where I was studying community-based natural resource management in Southern Africa. And that system of resource governance is not perfect, but one thing it tries to do is devolve control of natural resources from the federal government down to local communities. And it's kind of a similar question. What is a community? And in Namibia, at least, the Constitution and the Nature Conservancy Act that enables CBNRM basically says a community can be whoever you want it to be. When you want to formulate your conservancy, you and whoever you want in your neighbors come together and outline a territorial area. And you might be a group of 50, you might be a group of 500, maybe less, maybe more. But you come together and you decide you are this community who's going to form this conservancy. And then you can apply to become one. And I would say the same kind of thing can go for local knowledge. I mean, you might be often we differentiate kind of local knowledge from sort of like Western scientific ways of knowing that is done in the university, but maybe you are a university professor either working in Africa or in Canada or across the global north, and engaging in traditional and local ways of knowing. So I think that there's no binary way to think of like local versus non-local knowledge, but I really like the way Patricia frames it. But local knowledge is what people want it to be.
Yeah, so from our side, I would just come to add on what my colleagues have said. Regarding the local knowledge, as we can say, we have now two, let's say, components, the local knowledge and how this local knowledge was transferred. So basically, the local knowledge for our synthesis project, we're trying to get it from the already, let's say, scientific evidence that is there, the surveys that is there, but it comes to reflect how the people, the communities over the region are adapting to the climate impact, how they are. We can say that some communities have changed their to another, and Patricia said some others have already some kinds of plants that will predict that there will be raining or not. So there is some valuable knowledge that is there, but now we need to emphasize on the other point that this knowledge and how it was transferred is really a questionable point, because for example, in our synthesis project and initiative, the BAOBAB initiative has put like a very big effort on what we call the knowledge brokering, which is like a very important to how we can simplify information from one side to another, how politics, let's say, profiles can speak to the communities and how they can understand the communities, and also from the other side how these communities understand that are put there for their own. So there is like here two tricky points. Like we have the local knowledge that is there, so we need to understand it, we need to already put some effort to understand and to like see how to avoid the disinformation as discussed before, and then see how like the governance are simplified and locally grounded for the communities. So it was a very good question. It's a real concern, actually.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your amazing answers. And as you were talking, I'm also looking at the chat and the great questions that are already coming in from our audience. And I see that there are a few questions exactly on local knowledge and indigenous knowledge. And what we had one great question is, how do we differentiate between local and indigenous knowledge? Because very often they are used as synonyms while they're quite distinct or quite different, and also how disinformation can be a cause or can contribute to recurring crises. So acute crises like for example, farmer and pastoral crises, not only in Nigeria, but in many other places in the Sahel and other parts of Central Africa as well. I see that we also have some hands up, so maybe we can go to Eugene and then Alan. So let's, if you can give us your questions, and then maybe if we can get another one as well, or I can choose from the chat, and then we'll have our speakers answer them. So Eugene, over to you, and then Alan.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me in this very interesting conversation. I just have one question. I think any of the panelists should be positioned to respond if they feel that, because one of the central running theme, as you pointed out, has been the problem of disinformation. And when we think about disinformation, we think about that in terms of actors outside the group that recognizes that climate change is an urgent and important challenge. But within the community of those who admit that climate change is a problem that we need to resolve, there is a different phenomenon that's evolving, which is what we refer to in our circles as false narratives. A good example would be the idea that adaptation is not uh, uh, evidence for adaptation and success of adaptation is difficult to capture, and therefore make the case that adaptation financing cannot be properly evaluated and therefore justified. But we've also had narratives around the demands from African continents, countries that adaptation finance should be grant-based, free, and public finance that is victim to positioning, which again tries to eliminate or justify the quest for climate justice from the African continent. So could we, and that's my question now, could we also argue that the kinds of narratives that are produced from within the community of those who admit that climate change is a crisis that we have to address could also delay and have an impact on how quickly and thoroughly we address the climate crisis, especially from the perspective of the African continent?
Thank you for this very timely question. So, looking at false narratives, mis or disinformation coming from within the community, not only from malicious actors from outside the community. So, how do we deal with that? Thank you very much. And Adam, over to you. If you could share with us your question.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed, all of you, dear participants, presenter, organizer, and especially the presenter, Dr. Andrew, Miss Bargam, and Lina, and Patricia. Thank you very much for the idea that you are providing to us, because the climate issue, it's becoming the trauma bonding, right? The idea, the trauma bonding of the society, and it is the right moment to say a lot and to become together to find a brilliant solution for the common gaps that the people of the society is facing. My question especially goes to Dr. Andrew. This is Alam. First of all, I'm very sorry. This is Alam Shambal Alfo from Ethiopia. I'm a lecturer of public relation and strategic communication, and also a doctoral candidate in public relation, crisis and state communication at University of South Africa. And also I'm working on digital media literacy, climate action, and climate diplomacy and governance. And I'm also a researcher on media, migration, and climate change here in Ethiopia. So it's directly, since I'm from the communication world, my question is directly to Dr. Andrew. Dr. Andrew, in order to ask directly the question, what media strategy or what digital media strategy is important to implementing or to bring a good solution for Africa, since Africa is still now disappropriate for the contribution of the climate change, since we are victim, but we are not the main cause of the climate emission. But what digital media strategy is very important from your experience, from the Western perspectives. So in order to make it, the ball on the ground, right?
Thank you, Alam. So to wrap it up, so we have the first question is, what do we do when false narratives come from within the community, not from outside of the community, from Eugene, and then from Alam, what media strategies do we have to combat mis and disinformation? And I will just pluck it one question from the chat. Should we consider disinformation then a climate risk if it is impacting which adaptation approaches we take? So I think maybe we can start from whoever from our speakers would like to take first stab at this, and then work towards all of our questions.
I don't mind starting, unless anyone else wants to go. So two really good questions that are very linked, and I'll try to give a brief answer. I can talk about this stuff forever. If anybody wants to reach out, happy to continue these conversations. But what happens when disinformation is inside the community? We need to understand that as such. In my presentation, I pointed to a few actors. I think we very often think of like Russia, Iran, China, fossil fuel companies, other nefarious actors. But part of the reason disinformation is so successful is because of the misinformation part of it, which is also why I said it misinformation is best understood as disinformation, because very often the disinformation flows are coming from those actors or similar types of actors that I mentioned, foreign states, nefarious actors that want to sow divide within society. But it's harder for Russia or a Russian bot to get to me in my social media feeds and me end up believing it. But once they go through a number of actors and the disinformation and the tweets and posts that they spread kind of get cycled and sort of washed and laundered through the very diverse information ecosystem, and then eventually someone like my mom or cousin resends it, I become more susceptible to that kind of thing. So very often the disinformation is coming from inside our community, and we need to understand that. But we also need to understand that people like my mom or cousin are not coming up with, they're not just randomly deciding that climate change is not real or that the world is flat. Right? It is coming from these kind of nefarious actors. So we need to understand that. And then again, the strategies that we need to think about. So the one question about what media strategies, one thing that I didn't talk about a lot is the solutions. And I think we need to think of whole of society approaches. In the Canadian context, I mentioned the limits of Prime Minister Trudeau saying that the carbon tax is the best form of climate policy and this is going to help us. There are limits to government and what government can do, because again, government is often part of the contribution of that divide, because people don't trust government very often. So we do need to think of whole of society approaches where we engage with people throughout our communities, as I've mentioned, which can hopefully tamp down some of the disinformation coming from communities, increase trust within those communities. And part of that obviously is media strategies as well. The question was, what can I communicate from what the West or Canada is doing effectively in this regard? We are not doing anything effectively in this regard. We have a really problematic media landscape that is only getting worse and only going to get worse. And that's why I don't think Canada is doing better than countries in Africa or elsewhere in dealing with this challenge. I think that this is the kind of thing that we have to figure out together. For media strategies, we need to effectively fund traditional types of legitimate media sources. But realizing people are not going to always consume those, we need to, again, the kind of we that is concerned about things like climate change, get out there and effectively use the other types of media sources and those other influencers in society, as I mentioned, like the disinformers, to be able to get at people from different ways, because all of us are consuming media in so many different ways. So there's a lot of those different types of strategies that we need to think about that are whole of society approaches, leveraging communities, and really seeking to increase trust and decrease polarization.
Thank you very much for this very insightful answer. Bush, I see that you have unmuted. Perhaps you want to go next.
Yeah, thank you, Lina. Well, it's actually very interesting to come with these points, especially we are talking about communities where we are trying to consider and value their knowledge and to understand it. But then comes the disinformation that maybe will emphasize the problems over the region. And this comes to the point asked in the chat regarding should we consider the disinformation as a climate stressor? So we need to understand that we need to differentiate between the climate stressors, or what we call here the extreme climate events, such as the drought, floods, etc. Then we have other components, especially the livelihood, etc. And we can see here the very concerning point, which is the disinformation that need to be considered. It's not a climate stressor, but it's actually a component that come to emphasize the impact of these climate stressors. So, and how we can deal with this disinformation. I will come to the very important point, which is the knowledge brokering. As I said, during or about within the BAOBAB initiative, we are trying to we are formed to what we call the knowledge brokering at all levels. So starting from politics profiles to the science, talking with scientifics, also scientifics within with each other, and also how we can speak and understand and interact with the communities. It's also very important. Then how we can ensure that the knowledge produced from or transferred from the communities is wrong or false. It's very let's say relative, because we also need over the at the level of communities social activists, social scientific, or let's say people that will come to do this analysis, that have this knowledge, local knowledge, and also have this ability to communicate with the communities, because sometimes this information, as discussed, is not produced like with intention to be like this information, because the way the communities are transferring their problems, the way they are transferring how their livelihoods, their way of adaptation, etc., can be different from what they really mean. So this also can cause a problem. So if we have people that can be like have this balance and understand both of the levels, this can ensure relatively like at some level a correct information. But at all time we need to have this in mind and keep it in mind that some knowledge or some local knowledge also need to be checked, to be analyzed in light of how far is it wrong or right. But again, it's a really concerning point to consider. Like the local knowledge is not that easy. It's not direct. It needs to go through many steps before being considered. But yeah, it's not a climate stressor. It comes to emphasize the problems and the issues over the region. As we said, the communities are not anymore considered as passive victims in both levels. They are producing. They have their own ways for adaptations, etc. But they are also transferring knowledge, and this knowledge needs to be checked and analyzed before being considered. This is it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bushra. And we have just enough time for Patricia's answer.
I just want to add to what my co-presenters have said today. The problem of climate disinformation, misinformation, to address it is a multi-layered approach. In as much as most of the information is coming from the communities, it also needs a combination of our own personal vigilance to it and the structural changes from policy to media. And like we said earlier, in as much as we want to show the significance of locally grounded climate adaptation measures, it also goes in line with scientific background. There must be expertise to prove this climate misinformation, to recheck, verify whether they are coincide or whether they are in truth or not. So before the community also need the support of climate expertise, scientific expertise, so that whatever they said will be verified and rechecked. That's just what I want to add.
Thank you very much to all of our speakers, to our audience for these very, very good questions. Unfortunately, we won't have the time to go through all of them, but I encourage you to reach out to our speakers, to reach out to the organizers if you would like to continue discussing these topics. Thank you very much for making the time to join us today, and for our speakers for their great presentations. And I will pass it over to Rosalind for the final wrap-up. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Lena, for handing over the mic and coordinating between the speakers, the participants, especially for the Q&A. I'd like to give a special thanks to everyone who joined, especially from the participants. Thank you for the engaging questions, especially about disinformation and misinformation, how to have adaptive approaches and the mitigation around the resolution of the issue. But much more thanks to the presenters to give us such expert insights on the climate adaptation and the conflict around migration, as well as the adverse effects on the African community. With that said, as well, I would also like to invite everyone for our upcoming webinar, which will be held on the 9th of June, which is going to tackle about the conflict, the aid costs, as well as the effects around the Ebola virus in the country of DRC. Please do check the chat box. You'll see the rest of the details. If there's anyone who wants to continue this conversation, please do reach out on our website, our social media platforms, whether be it LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. You'll find the Real Life Research African program. Please feel free to like, share, and respond to us. So thank you, everyone. I hope you do enjoy the rest of the weekend and the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.